Hello, my beans. Today we will be playing mM2, because why not? So right now I am trying not to get killed. So now I am walking outside. Okay, I made it outside, but I see a min avatar. So I go to collect some coins. Then I practice to break some ankles. Then I climb on the boxes so I can get a better view. Then I get down because I don't see the murder. Then I get back and go on the top of the boxes. Then I get down and go to check if murder is anywhere because, yeah. Then I collected some more coins. Then I just walked around because I was bored. Then I jump on the military truck and jump of that. Then I go back on the boxes to look again for the murder. Then I get ready to get of the boxes. Then I got of them. Then I just walked around again. And a little more. And then a little more walking. Then I jump over the min avatar. Then I climb on the roof to get to the boxes. Then I hear the murder kill. Then I go collect more coins. Then, when I am perfectly collecting coins, the murder snuck up on me and killed me. Then I teleport back to the lobby. Then I just walked around and saw Rose's avatar. Then I walked to the voting area. Then I went upstairs. And I muted the voice chat. Then continued going upstairs. Then I got up finally. Then I had a nice sit down. Then had some ice cream. Then I broke my legs. Then just walked around a bit more. And then knocked this diva over.